Defense News. It's proudly sponsored by Navy Federal Credit Union. If you're a member of our nation's armed forces, the Department of Defense, or if your family is, we'd be proud to serve you too.
On this episode of Defense News Weekly, the state of counter-drone warfare. How is the Army evolving to meet the new deadly threat? A reporter talks to a commander leading the charge. Plus, we take a trip down to Fort Johnson in Louisiana to see how soldiers are preparing for a modern fight. Also, a Call of Duty tournament for troops comes to DC. We really gonna let the Canadian Air Force keep the trophy this year, boys? Come on, squad. We were on the scene for the action. And hang on, is the Navy running out of pants? What are you guys, the Marines? Just kidding. But the story is real. The Navy has a pants shortage. Stick around for that story. Finally, can you join the military if you have HIV? A new court ruling changes the parameters for excluding people with the disease. It's the latest in news and analysis from the Pentagon to the platoon, here on Defense News Weekly. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Diana Stancy. Drones, drones, drones. One of the biggest game changers in modern warfare continues to prove its place on the battlefield as a disruptive technology. Bullets, bombs, and missiles all still have their place, but now it's a combatant's ability to field a fleet of cheap, easy to control unmanned aerial systems that can change a conflict. Just ask Ukraine. So how does a force as big as the American military defend its troops and bases against threats like these? For the latest in counter-drone tactics and techniques, Defense News' Jen Jedson spoke with an Army leader working on the problem, who recently wrapped up an exercise focused on the topic dubbed Operation Hard Kill. Here's some of their talk on the topic.
I'm here with Major Entner. Major Entner, will you tell me a little bit more about what Operation Hard Kill is?
So Operation Hard Kill is a counter-UAS live fire exercise using both kinetic and non-kinetic means that we had occur here at Fort Drum, New York. The intent of why we wanted to do Operation Hard Kill here is for us is to show proof of principle that we can actually do counter-UAS live fires with both kinetic and non-kinetic systems, and also to use that to enable and expand our capabilities to do home station training for our soldiers who are continually rotating in and out of CENTCOM doing counter-UAS mission sets.
Okay, how has the division seen the threat evolve? You know, you talk about one-way attack. Tell me a little bit more about what that means. And talk a little bit more about ISIS has been sending. They've been messing around with UAS for many years now. So how have you seen that capability evolve in terms of, say, numbers of drones that they can deploy at once, a swarm, if you will? Is the size getting more difficult to counter? What are some of the concerns that you're seeing as the threat evolves? And obviously the threat gets developed just like we develop our counter UAS capability. So
it really is almost like a race of either the enemy developing and evolving their UASs to attack us versus us developing the technology that can actually counter that threat. And that's kind of where that quote unquote space race is. The thing about with a UAS and especially counter UAS is that it really gives any government, non-state actor, entity an access to an air force because drones are small, cheap, easy to reproduce. It doesn't have a pilot associated with it sometimes. Sometimes UASs will fly by waypoints. Sometimes it's got a ground control station. Depends on whatever UAS you're trying to fly is. So how do we counter a various not so much the different types of systems, but also the quantity of those systems because they are so quick to reproduce. So a lot of the technologies that we want to make sure we're seeing and being able to learn about and be able to use and operationalize and refine those tactics is based upon whatever the threats are going to be. And that's why 210, another unit we're sending to CENTCOM is beneficial because they will have that most subject matter expertise. By the time they come across that mission set again, a few years after they just got done doing it, that threat might be vastly different because it might be how the enemy has evolved their systems to counter us, countering them. So it's really a counter to counter to counter fight. Normally that's something you've seen like in the air defense community since, we as air defenders, we're the ones who, take out the aerial threats. But because it's so large and so now refined and innovative. It's got to be a threat that everyone has to be able to counter. So for us, at least for 10th Mountain as well, so they're not going to always have access to, programs of record, actual air defense systems. How do we refine and expand our training, not just for the CENTCOM mission set, but for a holistic counter UAS, being able to do that mission set in any AOR, in any sort of large-scale combat operations, especially from a light infantry division, where the soldiers are literally going to the battlefield with just a rucksack on their back, and the weapon in hand. How can we train them to be able to do a counter UAS mission set? Because those small Group 1 to Group 3 drones or small micro, those can be something that can, be facing as a threat in their environment. So obviously taking what we get from 210, also seeing what is coming down the pipeline of what industry is coming up with, working with DEVCOM to see what that's on the breach to be. How can we take that to actually enhance the 10th Mountain training for our infantry units and prepare them for large scale combat operations?
Sure. Now, it seems like there's a vast amount of capability that industry is bringing to the table, has brought to the table, and that continues to grow. Obviously, without naming names of industry participants, can you talk a little bit about, how the 10th Mountain is able to ingest this amount of technology and capability, take it in, decide, this works for us, this doesn't for our mission. How do you manage what is a large amount of capability coming from industry?
So I think this can be literally something to learn from every system. I kind of grew up on the principle that everything is an example, whether it's a good example you want to follow or a bad example of what to avoid. This is kind of how when I teach my younger leaders, how to go about it. It's kind of the mantra I teach them. And you can apply that same type of principle when it comes to working with DEVCOM and the industry partners, is that these systems, they're going to have a capability, or they're going to say they have a capability. And what we want to do is say, okay, here's what is being said, does that meet the intent of what we're seeing downrange, or maybe it's something that can be refined that way? We want to make sure that's a conversation that's routed through DEVCOM in that. So it's a matter of exposing the soldiers to that technology and then have them relay that information through DEVCOM that can eventually get itself back to industry partners. But for Operation Hard Kill, some of the things that we said, some of the things that we've seen was different types of systems. One of them is using direct energy. So that's one of our non-kinetic type systems that you're seeing. So it's not an actual bullet taking down a drone. It's actual direct energy being used for that. You have other systems that can be small, as using like a 5.56 round, which is something you'd see like in a M4, up to a 7.62, which you see like in a cruise serve weapon, all the way up to like a 2.75 rocket. So it's just an expanding based upon whatever system is being developed. What munitions are using for those systems will help that, because it doesn't take in consideration costs. We know that these drones are cheap to reproduce. Do you really want to expend some munition that can cost like thousands of dollars, or do you want to be able to use some sort of technology where it's like, pennies on the bullet to be able to take out? And that's kind of where you're seeing the industry kind of driving that, is so much the effectiveness of the system, but also the cost effectiveness of that system as well.
Any kind of major lessons learned that you'll take to, say, apply to the training at 10th Mountain or beyond? I know that this equipment is going, like you said, to a live fire at Red Sands Arsent. So, what are some of the very initial obvious things that you have, you're able to take away from this?
One of the biggest things I think we can take away, and on this one, is obviously like the logistics piece, making sure everything is good to go on that, making sure you've done our pre-coordination, your coordination as things are going on, and your coordination on the back end of making sure all the transportation requirements are good to go, just making sure that gets solidified. I think for us at 10th Mountain, though, is how do we make this a routine thing? So Operation Hard Kill is the first of its kind for 10th Mountain to actually do. But we don't want to be the last time we do something like this either. We know the threat is continuing to evolve. Our soldiers are going to come back with updated information. How do we routinely make this a thing that we can continue to update our tactics? And for that is more looking for how do we do those UAS live fires here at Fort Drum.
When we come back, learn how the Army is preparing soldiers at the Joint Readiness Training Center. Welcome back. As potential adversaries advance their capabilities on the battlefield, it's becoming increasingly important for troops to train for the enemy of the future, today. That fact is not lost on Army Chief of Staff, General Randy George, who is preparing troops at the Joint Readiness Training Center in Fort Johnson, Louisiana, by having them make real-time adjustments during combat simulations. Ground warfare editor Todd South recently made a visit to the JRTC to learn more about this approach.
This is Todd South of Military Times. We're down here at the Joint Readiness Training Center at Fort Johnson, Louisiana. It's one of the premier combat training centers that the Army has for doing brigade-sized rotations of actual live troops. They can do up to division-level stuff with simulations and even bring in core assets. So really big stuff can happen at these places. On the ground, you see multiple battalions moving around doing different stuff. Now that's been in existence for decades, but recently, under the current Army Chief of Staff, they've been trying to do a new quote-unquote transformation in contact. So in the past, what they would do is you would have a unit, say, deploying to Iraq or Afghanistan. They would work up for a number of months, get a new equipment, new personnel, test those things out, really work a battle plan at their home station, and then come to a major field training exercise here at a place like JRTC or at the National Training Center out in Fort Irwin, California. Now, those were pretty much locked in place. They were only going to be doing what they had been trained to do in their doctrine, very rigid from like their schooling and what the Army had been doing for decades and which was successful. Those kinds of tactics, same kind of reliable equipment, you're going to combat, that's what's happening. In order to change anything, whether it was equipment or tactics or procedures, that would take mountains of paperwork, bureaucracies back in DC or the Pentagon and different agencies all over the Army, which are quite important and do provide a lot of input and research and things for those types of changes. But instead, the new chief, General Randy George, is really pushing them to transform, make these adjustments kind of on the fly, like as they're preparing. So the 2nd Brigade of the 101st Airborne Division out of Fort Campbell began with a kind of a practice rotation down here back in January to troubleshoot and kick the tires on what they needed, what they didn't need, going against a very skilled opposition force down here, kind of playing the bad guy. They got to do that rotation in January to kind of like get some lessons out of it. And very rapidly, in about 6 months or so, they made a bunch of adjustments to their plan, to their structure, to their communications equipment, to their training. I'm adding a lot of drone training for their soldiers to get them in the field and using those drones and using them offensively and defensively, checking out new sensors, trying new methods of decoy, and built all that up. I've come down here now in August to be out in the field for a number of weeks. Most of that time recently that we've been here has been called quote unquote in the box, which means they're basically being pressured on a long-term 72, 96-hour mission, constant nonstop, 24 hours a day, sleeping in the field when they can sleep, and running those missions against the opposition force. Now the opposition force down here, they call them Geronimo. They're basically very seasoned, well-trained soldiers of all ranks and levels, running pretty much a battalion or more, sometimes up to a brigade with simulation size, maybe 750 personnel actually live, with additional simulations for effects on different types of units, support, artillery, tanks, their own drones. Those guys here live here year-round, do 2 and 3 year tours or longer here. They do them all the time. They're very well seasoned. They know the terrain. They know the equipment. And then they take that knowledge and they apply it against the force like the 101st. They're using tactics like the Russians are using in Ukraine, like the Chinese might use out in the Indo-Pacific. And they're testing that unit, testing the 2nd Brigade of the 101st. Now, the 2nd Brigade of the 101st has taken a new kind of construct called a mobile brigade combat team, where they're lightening up the load. They're shrinking headquarters. I mean, headquarters are shrinking down from, maybe a few years ago, 60 people having to run an entire brigade in a headquarters down to 20-something last year. They're saying they can do it with 8 personnel now. Now with that technology, those drones are able to move faster, react quicker, identify things more easily, and get their job done and get to the objective or defend a position if they have to. This is part of a larger effort of the Army, not just transforming contact globally, but with certain brigades, one also out of Hawaii, one out of Fort Drum up in New York, the 10th Mountain Division. They're experimenting with their own kind of configurations of these brigade combat teams, trying to see how they might employ them in a future combat, be it in the Pacific, be it in Europe, be it anywhere, CENTCOM. And they're using those types of testings, experimentations to figure out what's the Army going to need to fight, where it needs to fight against the next adversary tonight, today, not 5 or 10 years from now. So that's what we've been seeing here at the JRTC, where we've got a lot of interesting technology and talked to a lot of interesting soldiers and leaders about how they're doing this change and what it means for the Army. This is Todd South of Military Times.
And in headlines from around the military, speaking of drones, North Korean state media this week released images of suicide drones it says the country is developing as part of its military arsenal. The new images showed at least 2 types of white ground-launched drones fired at stationary targets and exploding. Also included in the pictures, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un overseeing the exercise. North Korea has been engaged in frequent saber rattling in recent months amid tensions with South Korea and the US. Next, a U.S. District Court judge in Virginia has ruled that the Defense Department may not prohibit people with asymptomatic HIV from joining the military. Previously, judges had also ruled that troops with HIV who maintained steady treatment were capable of doing military jobs, including deployment. The recent suit was brought by a 24-year-old soldier separated from the service because of his HIV status. The judge said excluding HIV-positive people from military service made little sense, since symptoms and transmission potential are now both easily curbed with oral medication. Sailors around the globe may have a hard time getting a hold of the Navy working uniform Type 3 trousers due to a massive shortage both at Navy exchange stores and online. The trouser inventory stock level is currently at approximately 13% worldwide, according to a spokesperson from the Navy Exchange Service Command. The Navy Exchange is coordinating with the Defense Logistics Agency on this issue regarding the uniform's production and supply chain, as well as the Chief of Naval Personnel on mitigation strategies to reduce impact to the fleet. The Defense Logistics Agency says that the shortage first started in April and that they have secured several contracts since then, with deliveries starting in October. Full support to the Navy Exchange Service Command is expected in the second quarter of fiscal year 2025. Meanwhile, the Chief of Navy Personnel is encouraging sailors to minimize wear and tear on the Navy working uniform Type 3 trousers and instead opt for other working uniforms like coveralls. When we return, give a person a fish and they'll eat for a day, teach them the value of compounding interest over time, and they'll thank you from their yacht on the Bahamas one day. Our financial expert is back with advice on teaching military kids the basics of finance when we return. Welcome back. On this edition of Money Minute, Jeanette Mack from Navy Federal Credit Union talks about how you can teach your military child basic finance and budgeting strategies.
It's important as parents to remember to include the money talk in the many lessons you teach your children, especially if they're headed to boot camp. Military life comes with unique challenges and opportunities, making it even more important to get savvy about money. So before they head to basic training, prep them with the basics of money management. Maybe they've had a part-time job and a paycheck, but soon they'll be getting their first military paycheck. It's going to include various forms of income like basic pay, which is their salary, and allowances for housing, food, and clothing to pay for a place to live if off base, meals, and uniforms. Later on, they may get special pay and incentives. Teach them what to expect and how to manage this new income. Since they won't be allowed to travel or take time off, basic training is an excellent time to start saving the money they earn. If they're disciplined through active duty, it could become quite a tidy sum. Talk to them about safely using credit and only when necessary. Set savings goals for big things like a car or house. And last but not least, have them create a budget they can stick to and encourage them to always keep learning new strategies to become money smart.
Thanks, Jeanette. We'll see you next week. To get more coverage of military and defense topics, flip down your nods and look around at Dark Room from militarytimes.com and defensenews.com for more headlines. And to get wicked smart, as New England troops say, sign up for our early bird brief, compiled each morning to bring you the most recent headlines. Lastly, if social media is where you find open source intelligence, follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X, formerly known as Twitter. And until the government pulls the plug, we're on TikTok, so go find us there as well. When we come back, the long national nightmare of the Canadian Air Force beating the US in a Call of Duty tournament is brought to a close. Or is it? Find out when we return. Welcome back to Defense News Weekly. I'm Diana Stancy. The annual Call of Duty Endowment Bowl has quickly become a marquee matchup of military service branches from the US, UK, and Canada, gathering to go head-to-head in an esports tourney that doubles as a way to support helping recent veterans find jobs. This week, the 5th annual Code Bowl was in Washington, D.C., and we were on hand to learn about the endowment and see who would take home this year's crown. It was the Royal Canadian Air Force trying to defend their 2023 title. Could they keep it? We went to find out.
Hello and welcome to Code Bowl 5. I am so excited to be here. We've got Warzone, we've got an incredible competition, and this is going to be non-stop action. Come on, son!
This is the Call of Duty Endowment Bowl. We are going to be competing against the other armed forces branches. Each team is comprised of 2 service members and 1 influencer, and then each branch gets 2 teams. So we'll drop into Mini Royale. Our guys will get as many kills as they want, and then they'll try to win the game. So if they get first place, they get to double their kills. So if you got 20 kills and you get first place, you get 40 points. If you come in second to 10th, you get a 1.5 times multiplier, and anything less than that, you just get a 1 times multiplier. So our goal is to get in there, drop in fast, drop in hot, get as many kills as we can, destroy the other teams early, rack up those points, and then win the game.
So I have a full-time day job. Gaming is not my full-time day job. I wish it was, that'd be amazing, but I'm not one of the branches that have like dedicated players, unfortunately. So my day job, it's responding to a lot of the sectors, which are, you know, a subunit, and coordinating things, planning things, and just making sure everything's running smoothly throughout California. So with the level of competition here, I would say the big strategy, and I'm sure many teams will do it, is stacking. So just having your team kind of on top of you, not going off and doing any solo 1v1s, trying to fight, you know, 1v3. Stacking is a common term used in the Call of Duty industry, and it essentially just has your teammates like on top of you, willing to like trade out and make sure that there's continuity. So like someone's always alive to get a buyback. Whereas like when you're playing in pubs, you can afford to branch out and chow 1v4s, 1v3s. But in this scene, this competition, like you got to be on top of each other.
This is the Army. They're on top for a reason. They're one of the top squads here, and they are dominating thus far. Iceman with a huge flank, picks up one. Looking for the second, can't find it. In trouble with the mortar and everything in between on his head.
So the Code Bowl, today's event, is really helpful in creating awareness about the need and desire to drive veterans into high quality jobs, and also to raise funds for that mission as well. Every cent we raise goes directly into placing vets in jobs. So the Call of Duty Endowment is the largest private funder of veteran employment. To date, we've funded the placement of over 130,000 veterans into high quality jobs across the economy. And last year we did it for 1/20th the cost of the federal government's efforts. Gaming is an incredible vehicle for this cause because honestly, this is where our veterans are, especially our young veterans, those in the most need of help finding high quality employment, and with the longest runway ahead of them in terms of their careers. This is where they play, relax, socialize, stay in touch with their battle buddies. This is the place for them, so they know exactly what we can offer them for free.
You got a full team of 3. It's the Marine Corps here to make a statement, here to get a win in the final map of the day, and they're certainly able to do it.
U.S. Army Esports are your Code Bowl 5 winners. Bring them on up, U.S. Army. Hey, come up, your champions of Code Bowl 5.
Congrats to the U.S. for taking the crown this year. Nicely done. Well, that's all we have time for in this episode. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.